first 5 sins. Let's move on to the 6th, self-indulgence. And this essentially is indulging one's whims or desires without any restraint or thought about what you're doing. And there's really 3 categories that come into play here. It is, echoing your opinion or offering a judgment that really isn't based on any fact, speculating as to what the facts are, or in worst case, exaggerating and suggesting something is much worse or better than it really is. And so once again, we hear this reoccurring lesson when using email, and that is that we need to stick to the facts and be objective, as objective as we possibly can. This is an example, again, another example of an email from our claims files that illustrates this self-indulgent attitude. This email is actually from an architect responding to a report critical of his design. And he first acknowledged that his design did not comply with the code, and he did so in an earlier email. And now in this email that you're looking at, he is trying to explain away the multiple failures of a single canopy pole, of several poles, and using his opinion to demonstrate that he was aware of this condition when he did the original design and did not design for it. So it's a great example of self-incrimination. And in this case, the claim resulted in about $100,000 settlement. And this email and this information factored heavily into how that claim was ultimately evaluated. The next sin is too much information, and in this case, what we're really talking about is information offered without context or incriminating information that may be offered as an explanation or justification. And so in this case, we've got emails or information being presented via email with no context, no discussion of the seriousness or merits of the findings. And so what should we consider deleting in this? Well, new employees to your firm do have a higher risk of errors and omissions, and it's not just an experience-related issue. They're new to the organization, new to your processes, new to how you do things, and do last-minute changes result in errors or issues? Yeah, they may. And so if we look at a better way to communicate these things, this is what I would suggest. Again, kind of going back to that original lesson, sticking with the facts. Trevor has 12 years of experience with similar projects, and he's going to be a benefit to the team. So when we are crafting our emails, it's a challenge for us in understanding we want to be objective, we want to be fact-based, but we also want to recognize the information that we are providing is of value and can be justified. So what can we kind of take away from this first part in looking at these 7 deadly sins? There's several things that we need to pay attention to. We do not want to be pointing self-incriminating fingers at ourselves or at others. That doesn't mean we ignore problems. It doesn't mean we ignore the providing good customer service, but we don't use email as a platform to point those things out. Our emails should focus on solutions and what needs to be done or potentially needs to be done to correct a situation. Our emails need to be fact-based and avoiding drama, avoiding hyperbole, avoiding speculation. And when we are choosing words, they are words that serve a purpose. We will craft emails in a way that doesn't necessarily represent the way we talk in conversations, but that we are sticking to the facts. And every word, while every email will serve a purpose, every word within that email will serve a purpose, and eliminating filler words along the way. Some other things is, short messages are really a goal. Short messages get read. Short messages are easier to understand. When you think about it, short messages are easier to craft, and short messages are less likely to be misinterpreted. So editing our emails, again, looking for opinion, speculation, exaggeration, things that don't represent the facts, removing those, and really a focus on the facts at hand. So we've talked about
Randy.
Yeah,
Randy, if I could jump in, I'd just like to emphasize Randy's deadly sin number one, to avoid self-criticism. We see this a lot in our company, and we see it in our engineering culture. It's our culture to continuously reassess, continuously reevaluate our work, and that's fine. Well, let's not put it in an email. If we get into problems with clients or litigation, those things really hurt us, even though we had good intentions. So don't put an email, and that's the time to pick up the phone and call our team members to discuss that reevaluation. But we want to avoid those situations where we're saying, we could have done a better job on this, or I went back and looked at the other alternative and it could have worked. Again, that's time to pick up the phone and set aside the keyboard. Thanks, Randy.
Yeah, thanks, Dennis. And I'll just underscore something that I heard you say, and that is often we can be much better served by picking up the phone and having a conversation rather than replying to an email or addressing issues over email. So having that as a backdrop to the things that we see firms do that can get themselves in trouble, let's kind of talk about what we think are positive steps, positive practices that we can employ. And so there's 10 things that we think if each of our emails is held up to these 10 things, we may not be able to accomplish all 10 of these things, but certainly most of them, that we put ourselves in a position of crafting successful emails and emails that will be read, understood, and not misinterpreted. So the first step is really, why are we sending this email? And it even applies to when we are replying to an email. What are we trying to accomplish? And is this about giving information, confirming an agreement, delegating work, something as simple as making an appointment? If we begin with that end in mind, we then put ourselves in the right frame of mind to then keep an email concise and focused on what we're trying to accomplish. We also want to look at our audience, and so if our audience are non-engineers, we want to be very mindful of removing or not using any kind of technical jargon that may confuse or may have little or no meaning to the recipient. So understanding who they are, and also are these individuals that could take our message out of context. So abbreviations, acronyms, euphemisms, all of those things need to be, if they're used, to do so with very, very, very careful consideration. You know, in my opinion, the best practice is not to use them, but if they are going to be used, that we understand our audience will understand that message just as we intend for them to understand it. A strong subject line, and this seems like a very basic email practice, but one of the things that a subject line or a caption does for you as a sender of an email is it gets the reader's attention. You might even think of it as, this is my opportunity to sell the person on opening my email first and paying attention to it. It's the caller ID of your email, if you will. It also can let the recipient know why you've sent the email. One of the things that I have done, and it's been pretty successful for me, is if I am sending an email to someone that does not require immediate attention, or if it is an email that's really just to give them information on something that may occur in the future, is I'll indicate that in the subject line so that they know this is not something they need to pay attention to immediately. Now, one of the things is if you are caught in an email thread, as many of us often are, the subject may change at some point during that reply and going back and forth. My suggestion is to create a new email message with a new subject line. And in terms of down the road thinking, this allows us to identify documentation that may be pertinent to a dispute or an issue or a disagreement that takes place well after the project is completed. The third thing, and this is kind of taken from the United States military, bottom line up front, right out of the gate or at the beginning of our email, we want to state within the first 2 lines of the message, why are we writing this email? We don't want to bury the lead. We don't want to make the recipient read the entire email to figure out what we're looking for. We want to give them exactly what we want or make the request up front, and then subsequent to that, give them more information that supports what our bottom line is. And what this allows for, in my opinion, is that our emails will get read faster. They'll be understood and comprehended the way we intended it. So an example of something like that would be an email that opens with this. Here's a quick summary of our phone call. Please confirm by Friday that you approve of this additional scope of work. So right out of the gate, we've identified what this is. It's a summary of our phone call, and we have indicated a call to action. We're looking for your confirmation by a certain date. And this becomes kind of this next item is kind of it can be a challenge for a lot of us, particularly on projects that move very quickly, that have multiple issues going on at the same time. But one practice that can serve us well is keeping one particular topic per email. And so that one topic may be an issue, a decision, a request for information, and again, it kind of supports the earlier practices of establishing the bottom line up front and in the first couple of sentences indicating what we're looking for. And so if our email is addressing multiple topics, it can make it more difficult for us to follow those earlier principles. The next practice is this issue of edit, edit, edit. It's far too easy, and it's easy for us to understand why we fall into this trap, but it's far too easy for us to punch out an email and glance over it once and hit the send button. And what I'm going to suggest is that we take a few moments, we carefully read it. That gives us the opportunity to identify words that are unnecessary, to identify typos, when we look at it again, often we can kind of look at it through a little bit of a different lens and put ourselves in a position of finding phrases that may not necessarily make sense, phrases that we may have typed out of order, so that we can correct that. But really to take the time to edit, edit, edit. And the things that we want to look out for are some of these words. So extreme words, words of promise, words of multiple meaning. These are all words that if you have spent any time with our other educational offerings around contracts and agreements with clients, that we've identified as red flag words. These words can be problematic in contracts, and they can be equally problematic in your emails. And so these are words that if you inadvertently include them in an email, certainly taking the time to remove them and look for a more appropriate substitute.
Randy, I'm going to jump in on that one too. On the red flag words, our company is careful to remove these words from client contracts. In fact, these words don't appear in Hansen's contract, our form of contracts, because we don't want to be contractually bound or have a client or judge interpret our contracts against us. So, again, we remove those words in contracts. We also want to remove these words so we're not bound by them by a client, or that we elevate the client's expectations because we've made these statements in emails. So same theory, we don't want to be bound by these terms and therefore want to remove them from our emails. Thanks, Randy.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so I alluded to this earlier, but we really believe that if you want your email to be read and certainly understood, keeping it short, keeping sentences short, our suggestion is 5 sentences or less per email. Personally, I happen to be a big fan of actually liberally spacing my paragraphs apart. So I will just type a couple of sentences and that'll be one paragraph, move to another paragraph, but limiting the sentences. It makes emails easy to scan. It makes them a little bit easier to read. You recall one of the things that we commented on earlier is that many of our emails are written on mobile devices. And so while we may be drafting or creating the email on a full-size computer screen, the recipient doesn't have benefit of that. So keeping it brief, keeping it concise can certainly add to its readability. Again, being very specific as to what we're wanting to accomplish, what we're providing to the reader, not using jargon or generalizations. Headings. Some people have told me that they use bullet points to really drive home particular messages. I think that's an excellent idea. So that kind of formatting, even in a mobile environment, makes it easier to follow and easier for the reader to understand. And I think emails need to have a clear ending said another way, a call to action. So what is it that we want to do? Confirm this by Thursday. Let me know if you're available this week for a meeting. Again, if we are just providing information, we may want to end the loop right then and there and state that we don't need you to respond, or no response is required unless you have a question or unless something in the email is unclear to you. And so one of the other things that these best practices kind of do for us is, or in order to follow them, is if we can put ourselves in the recipient's shoes. Then that places us in a position to craft, I think, a more effective email along the way. Proofreading, I mentioned this earlier. It's easy for us to ignore this step. We may become a little bit too complacent or reliant on spell check. Those don't always work. Sometimes they will replace words that we intend with something else, and that can get us into trouble. So using spell check and one way to keep an email from being sent inadvertently or before you've had an opportunity to finish it or edit it and spell check it is your last step is in fact putting the recipient's name in the email address. And those that follow that practice have said that that's been helpful to them as well. This issue often comes up, and it's the question around confidentiality. There really is no such thing when it comes to email. Unless that email is between you and your legal counsel, that's really the only way to guarantee that it's confidential. But even then, you could find yourselves with that email that you intended to be confidential becoming public fodder. And so don't put it in an email if you're not ready for it to be up for public consumption or on the front page of the newspaper. Certainly if you're trying to deal with a sensitive matter, recognizing that the reply all option is not a good idea. And so the alternative really is having a phone call, having a face-to-face meeting so that you can make sure that that information is going to be kept confidential. All right, so the next step, really, the litmus test, do you need to write this email? Is it going to surprise the recipient? I think one of the things that we spoke about earlier is one of the dynamics of communication is that every communication carries some kind of emotional response on the part of the recipient. And if you don't know what that emotional response is going to be, if it's going to surprise them, it's probably not a good idea to use email as the platform in which to communicate. If you are emotionally charged or upset or angry when drafting that email, it might be a good time to just take a moment, chill out, and create some distance between, create some distance so that you're not hitting that send button immediately and then thus regretting sending an email later. Another way to look at this is this: when this email that you're sending, is this something that you'd be comfortable receiving from someone, or is it something, in your opinion, you'd rather have delivered face-to-face? There is no question that communicating directly with somebody over the phone or face-to-face can be much more effective than email, depending upon the messages and if those messages contain any kind of an emotional element. And while this may, I'm running the risk of having hundreds of Hanson colleagues reading their emails aloud before they send them, reading it to yourself and appreciating what is being said and the potential tone that could be interpreted can serve us well in understanding how a recipient is going to receive the message. If there's still a question in your mind, don't send it. If there's still a question in your mind about something that you're saying or the way that you're saying it, take it out. Picking up the phone and having the conversation often can be a much more constructive and effective way to deal with certain communication. All emails are discoverable, and the way this works is they will find it. Opposing counsel, the other side, even if it's a dispute that doesn't necessarily involve dramatic litigation, they will find it, and they will make a point of using that email to indicate that you as a designer, you as a project manager, you as a team member did not do your job, did not bring your best ability to the project. And we never really want the quality of our work to be defined by a single email. It's just, that would be a very unfortunate, and it's a very uncomfortable situation for any of us to be in. Let's talk about text messages for a moment. Text is a very, very quick and easy way for people to communicate, but it is not a great way to run projects. It's not a great way to negotiate scope changes or decide on how project information or project decisions are going to be made. There may come a time when we are going to have to define our communication protocols in our contract and scope of services, and narrowly define the circumstances in which text messages will be used or be deemed acceptable. I have had a client that has come forward and said that they've had clients that want all communication to be limited by text messages. It's a very, very dangerous situation to be in. Not all text messages are archived. There are some programs that allow that to happen, and so some firms have resorted to that. But text messages are not a great way to run a project. And so if you do have a client that tends to use text messages, my advice is acknowledge the receipt of the text and reply to it via email, so that you do have documentation of the guidance or response that you've offered to the client.
Randy, this is Kelly. I have a question for you, kind of related. On the HR side, I've come across employees who think that instant messaging features such as Skype, they see that as a confidential way to have sort of an offline conversation. And I have always advised that is not confidential. You need to pick up the phone and meet face-to-face. Has that been your experience as well? Would you advise the same, to treat a Skype conversation or an instant messenger or chat conversation the same way you would treat an email or a text?
I would treat, I agree with you, Kelly. I think to believe that those things are an easy way for us to have confidential communication, we're only fooling ourselves. Some of those things are archived, some of them are not. It depends upon the business. But if by its very nature, if something is confidential, we will want to keep it confidential. So to me, that means we will employ reasonable steps to keep that information confidential. And the best way to do that is with a phone call or to get up and walk down the hall and talk to a colleague and have that conversation and then decide from there how we want to treat this information and what we want to do with it.
Thank you.
The other side of this, and just a re-emphasis, is whatever the means of communication, and the reality is with our work, we might have clients or subconsultants, teammates that want to use text, or the reality is we're at a project site, we're in the field, we're traveling, and text may be easiest. Whether it's that, a text, some of the media that Kelly mentioned, or whatever the next generation of electronic correspondence will be, if there are critical substantive decisions, like Randy mentioned, change orders, sensitive project information, we want to then capture those things in an email. And that becomes our written confirmation of what was discussed and decided, whether it's with a client, teammate, another firm, or a subconsultant. And that's how we lock that in. Otherwise, it just becomes verbal, and then it's their word against ours, whether we got that direction change or other matters. So, again, thanks, Randy.
Yeah. Okay, so we've spent some time looking at what we do that's not necessarily a great idea with emails. We've spent some time talking about what we think are healthy practices to follow with emails. So let's look at a case study example of where we think the parties involved actually treated email seriously and followed a lot of these protocols that we're talking about. And so this is a dispute that we are currently dealing with. The parties involved are a public school district. The project is a new school facility that is in the middle of construction. In fact, we're right at the masonry work is underway. Our client is the architect, and the party that is kind of stirring the pot here is the contractor. And so these are the individuals that are involved. And so we've got a representative from the client, Charles. We've got the project superintendent for the contractor, Henry. This is the individual that we want to kind of pay a little bit of attention to as to how he is instigating some things. Olivia, our project manager, and Jack, who is the principal in charge. And so here's the situation. The contractor's representative repeatedly and frequently calls Olivia asking for clarifications and information about the design. Now, as it turns out, his questions are all answered in the construction documents. Yet he continues to pester her over the phone, and one of the reoccurring themes through each of his requests is that they're always an emergency. So so far it has not been unusual for him to be calling after hours in the car, calling Olivia, asking for information that he clearly has access to. Now, Olivia is doing as good of a job as she possibly can. She's responding to each of these requests. She's indicating that they are present in that information is present in the specs and drawings, and that information is readily available, and she's very timely in her responses. Then, as this goes on, the contractor complains to the school district or the representative with the school district that Olivia is actually non-cooperative and that because of this, she's actually slowing down the contractor's progress. Additionally, this individual has engaged in some, what I think most of us would agree, is some very unprofessional behavior during team meetings. So all of that kind of sets the stage and brings us up to speed where we're currently at. And so the email that I'm going to show you is an email that was sent by Charles, the contractor, to Olivia, the project manager. And I'm sorry, this is an email that is sent from the client, the school district, to Olivia. And in this email, the client is saying, look, the contractor's reached out to me. He indicates that you're slowing things down. He's made a request for information about the brick wall mock-up. Can you just give him the information he needs? Can you, instead of just telling him where it is in the construction documents and the specs, just tell him what it is. And that with things like this, it would really be helpful. Just give him the information so that he does not have to spend time looking through the specifications or the drawings. So here's the question. If you're in Olivia's shoes, what would you do? And furthermore, if you're in the role of a principal in charge or someone who is responsible for Olivia, what steps or what would you do? And so this is what the client ultimately did. There's two emails that came from the architect. There was an email from Olivia that went to the contractor and an email from the principal of the architectural firm that went to the client. So here's the email from Olivia to the contractor. She outlines what the mock-up should be, and she identifies where it is in the construction documents. So the question is, did Olivia handle this properly, or would you have handled it any differently? In our opinion, Olivia did exactly what she should do. In fact, I think some reasonable people would argue Olivia has been far too nice in this situation, and she, by virtue of being as responsive as she is, she's reinforcing this behavior. But what I want to point out in Olivia's response is she's unemotional. She's sticking with the facts. She's not accusing the contractor of anything, although she might be justified in doing so, and keeps it very, very factual. But what about the principal? If you were the principal witnessing all of the things that I've just outlined for you, would you do anything at this point? And in this case, the principal did. And I want to highlight some things in his email. First, he leads off with, I need to step in here. So he's injecting himself into this situation and very quickly identifying what this is about. Most of my comments are regarding Henry's protocols, procedures, and attitude, and Olivia should not be called out in any way for hindering the flow of information. Henry continues to circumvent the procedures of the A201, so that's the agreement that exists between the architect and the client. So right out of the gate, stating a fact that the contractor is not following agreed upon protocols. He goes on with some additional detail and then states this is another example of the contractor expecting our team to read and quote back the specs to him. It took Olivia 30 seconds to find the information. As the GC's project superintendent, he is expected to know these documents and how to use them. He requests this information by phone and expects an immediate response. These are not emergencies. And here's where I think he makes a really good point. Mock-ups are generally planned long in advance and scheduled for the architect. So this is a good example of Henry's lack of control on the project scope and schedule. But he doesn't stop there. He makes a point that it's really out of line to be calling Olivia non-cooperative, and that it's just another example of his failure to plan. He takes another step forward and points out that the contractor's outburst during project meetings should be considered harassment, and given where we are at this point in time in our current culture, things like harassment, those become fighting words. This attitude and outburst is not a one-time event, but appears to be habitual. I've witnessed it. Again, quoting from the A201 agreement. He also takes a step of debating whether to request this be read into the upcoming minutes so that it is even more concretely documented. He then has a call to action. I hope that this attitude will disappear, and that he's very serious about how his staff are treated, and leaves the door open for the client to contact him and discuss further if they wish. So I think in this case, Jack got a lot of things right. You could argue that the email exceeded the length that we talked about earlier under best practices. But for the most part, I think he stuck to the facts. He didn't really accuse the contractor of doing anything unless it could be substantiated with facts. He also was very clear about the action that he was contemplating taking. Additionally, he stated that these things have got to stop, and that he doesn't expect his people within his charge or his organization to be treated that way. So even though situations may become tense or we have to take some firm stances, I think Jack's email illustrates that you can do it in an email without incriminating yourself or without putting yourself in a position of falling prey to many of the email sins that we talked about at the very beginning of this presentation. So to kind of wrap things up, we have a real opportunity here, I think, to change the way we treat email, to change the way we our attitudes towards email so that these things can work for us, so that emails can be a thing of value. They can add value to the project delivery. The overriding theme in all of this is that it is up to us individually to do that. It's not really up to the other person, even if the other person is poor at crafting emails. We don't have to fall prey to that in our responses, and we can use these practices that we talked about in our responses to raise the level and professionalism of communications with our clients and our colleagues. So hopefully this has been helpful to everyone, and I appreciate being included in this event.
Thank you, Randy. I just want to say thank you for your time, and to Dennis as well for offering this learning opportunity for our folks. Everyone who completes both Part 1 and Part 2 will be eligible for 1.5 hours of professional development hours, as long as you fill out the form. So again, I just want to say thank you for your time and for sharing your expertise with us. And with that, we'll go ahead and end the recording. All right. Thank you so much, Randy. I think we're good. No longer recording.
You think that went okay?
there? Yeah, I do, actually. I think it went very well. Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, I do.
Okay. So do I need to give, so I will stop sharing. All right.